Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for another study of great chapters of the Bible. In prior lessons, we looked at the very beginning of the book, Genesis chapter 1, and we saw in that wonderful chapter the beginning of everything, the creation as it puts in Genesis 1 verse 1, the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we saw how purposefully and how intelligently God designed his entire creation, not only the entire vast universe that we spent some length talking about in that study, but also, more specifically, the earth and its inhabitants. We saw the creation of the animals, the birds, the fishes, and finally God's climactic creation of man. And we saw that God made man in his own image. And that was for a reason. God wanted to have not only fellowship and relationship with his crowning creation, man, but he wanted him to have a special bearing, an image, the mark of the divine within him in a way. We saw in Genesis chapter 2 how God had provided for man in companionship, in the marriage relationship. And when we ended chapter 2, everything looked just great. Everything was good. And things, if we stopped at the end of chapter 2, looked very promising. If not for a certain snake that shows up in chapter 3. And if the graphic hasn't given it away, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Genesis chapter 3. We're going to see how that very good image of God in man was marred, not by anything that the serpent made man do, but by the decision that man himself decided to rebel against God. Well, let's go ahead and let's start reading in Genesis chapter 3. Let's read the first few verses. Genesis chapter 3, beginning in verse 1 says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which Yahweh God had made. And he said to the woman, Indeed, has God said, you shall not eat from any of the tree of the garden? The woman said to the serpent, From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die. And the serpent said to the woman, You surely will not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Now we'll stop there for just a moment. I want you to notice some things with me. Usually the first thing that people wonder when we start to read Genesis chapter 3 is, what's up with this serpent? Who is he? Where did he come from? Why is he evil? Why is he doing what he's doing? And there are all kinds of theories, and commentators spend pages and pages and pages trying to ascertain the origin of this being. But to put it bluntly, the Bible doesn't tell us. Obviously, the serpent is a created being. He's one of God's creatures. And obviously, he has a will of his own to choose whether he will obey God or rebel against him. There's a lot of debate, like I said, about all these questions. But the bottom line is, we just don't know. We don't know where he came from, why he is like he is. Genesis doesn't really offer any explanations to us. But one thing we do know is that he shows up throughout the Bible. In fact, we find at the very end of the Bible, in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9, it speaks of a great dragon that was thrown down, and calls him the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. Now here in our text, in Genesis chapter 3, he's not called Satan or the devil. Simply, he's referred to as the serpent, right? But, of course, there's more identification given to him in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9, and it fits the methodology or the modus operandi of the devil and Satan throughout the book of the Bible. Two other facts I hope that are going to become clear. One is that evil did not originate with God. We had looked in a previous study concerning Calvinism, and we took the quote from one Calvinist named R.C. Sproul, who said that he was suggesting that God intended for evil to come about. Well, God didn't create evil. Secondly, even though there is evil, we see in the pages of the Bible that it is subject to God's power and God's will. And that becomes abundantly clear in the book of Job, in the first couple chapters of the book of Job, in fact. Let's get back to Genesis chapter 3. I want you to notice with me what the serpent does. The very beginning of his work is about planting doubt. That's his deception. Remember, Revelation 12 verse 9 told us that he deceives the whole world. Well, he began with just one person. He began to deceive Eve by planting seeds of doubt. And the way he does that is to get her, first of all, to doubt God's word. Now, he speaks very briefly and only once, but it's enough to get Eve to start wondering some things. At the very beginning in verse 1, he asks her, "Indeed, has God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden?" Right from the beginning, he misquotes God. And even though Eve repeats almost verbatim what the restriction was, we saw that in Genesis 2 in verses 16 and 17, she even made it a little bit more strict. She says, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die." Now, one thing I want to make sure, even though she made it more strict than God did, she knew the restriction. She knew exactly what it was that she wasn't supposed to do, but yet, through deception, through just a question, the serpent begins to plant seeds of doubt in Eve's mind, and maybe she starts to doubt what she had herself heard either from Adam or maybe even from God himself. We don't know. God could have repeated the restriction to Eve once he had created her. And then she begins to doubt God's goodness. In verse 4, the serpent said to the woman, "You surely will not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good from evil." Now look at verse 6. It says, "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate." Now we'll stop there for a moment. As she looked on the qualities of this food, she saw its appeal. And she must have wondered why God would withhold such delight from her, such food with such promise, at least as the serpent made it sound, right? She looks at this and she sees that it's got all these qualities, and so she takes it. The one thing that God said would be the wrong choice, well, that's the choice that she made. And she took it and she ate it. And I want you to notice something here. The same qualities or the same concept is used to refer through the Apostle John to the lure of the enticements of the world. In 1 John chapter 2, and in verse 16 through 17, John says, "All that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away, and also its lusts, but the one who does the will of God lives forever." Now, the great deceiver has been using the same tactic ever since the beginning, because he knows what works. It worked with the first woman, with the first man and woman, and it's been working on people ever since. But I want you to notice something else. Back when we go to Genesis chapter 3, we didn't finish reading verse 6. After it tells us that she took from its fruit and ate, it says, "She gave also to her husband with her, and he ate." The implication is that Adam was standing right there. He was with her. What a colossal failure for Adam. He had the opportunity to be the leader of his very small family, to lead his wife, to be her protector. And he fails at that in a big way. And then we see the results of that. We see where their eyes were opened in verse 7. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. Verse 8 says, Then they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden. Then Yahweh God called to the man and said to him, Where are you? And he said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked. So I hid myself. And we'll stop there for a moment. The serpent promised enlightenment, right? He said in verse 5, God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened. And what does it tell us in verse 7? The eyes of both of them were opened. But they didn't see the fulfillment of the false promises that the serpent made. Instead, what they saw was something very, very different. Immediately, they saw their shame, and their feeble attempts to cover themselves proved insufficient, so insufficient that they thought they had to hide from God, which is itself a laughable idea. But they saw some things that they never thought probably they would see. First of all, they realized some things. Those opened eyes saw that knowledge brings responsibility. Now, eating from this fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil did provide some information for them. But what it did more than anything was it drove home their obligation to God. They had absolutely no excuse. They certainly couldn't plead ignorance because they knew exactly what God had said. In Romans 1 and in verse 20, it tells us that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Now, in Romans chapter 1, Paul's argument is against those who practice homosexuality. And he says this is not what God had intended. But he wants us to realize that we can always know that God is there. All we have to do is look at God's creation to know that he certainly exists. And if God exists, then he is higher than us. He is above us. And he has the absolute right to call the shots. And because he does have that right, we're responsible to him. We're accountable to him. This is something that was driven home acutely to Eve and to her husband. Secondly, they saw that the appeal of sin is ugly to God. Remember when Eve looked at the fruit there in verse 6, she saw how delightful it was, how appealing it was, but no matter how enticing that fruit might have looked, nothing could override the fact that the act itself was disobedience. It was heinous sin against God. And God's own word says that that is something he cannot abide. In the book of Habakkuk, in chapter 1 and verse 13, the prophet speaks of God's purity. He says, your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Well, that certainly was true in Habakkuk's time. It's true in our time, and it was certainly true in Eve and Adam's time. They saw also something that was shameful to them. They saw a nakedness that they could not cover. Although they tried, later on, they made for themselves loin coverings, verse 7 says, it would prove to be insufficient. They couldn't undo, nor could they cover up the shame that they now felt. In fact, the very end of chapter 2, remember, it said that the man and his wife were naked and were not ashamed. Well, now they were naked and they were ashamed, and they felt like they had to do something to cover it up. But there was nothing that they could do that would sufficiently cover up the shame of their nakedness. The shame of their nakedness only amplified the sin that they had done. And there was nothing they could do to undo it. And the same is true for you and I. Through the prophet Isaiah, It says that all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a filthy garment. Isaiah 64, verse 6. Well, for Adam and Eve, the loincloths that they tried to cover themselves up with were not only insufficient, it was just a reminder to them of how they had rebelled against God, of how they'd sinned against Him. And then the laughable idea that I told you about before, those opened eyes saw that they absolutely could not hide from God. That's the essence of futility. I mean, think about it. God was the one who prepared this garden. If anybody knew the garden, it was God. But God knew His creation as well. He knew what they were up to, and He knew where they would be. Jeremiah 23, verse 24 asks, "Can a man hide himself in hiding places so I do not see him, declares Yahweh?" Of course, that's a rhetorical question. The obvious answer is no. There is no place that we can go. In fact, that's what Psalm 139, verse 7 drives home to us. The psalmist asks, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" Now in Psalm 139, it's actually a very comforting psalm. The psalmist recognizes that there is no place he can go where God cannot reach him, where God cannot see him, where God cannot provide for him. But if you're rebelling against God, suddenly that comforting thought becomes a terrifying thought, knowing that there is nothing you can do or no place you can go that is hidden from God's side. And then we see back in Genesis chapter 3 the consequences of the sin that Adam and Eve had done. In verse 11, God asked Adam, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me from the tree and I ate." And Yahweh God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." Now we'll stop there for a moment. Adam has this golden opportunity to confess and repent in humility. And who knows how differently things might have turned out for them if only he had done that. But no, instead, the finger pointing starts, right? And Adam points fingers at two. He points the finger at Eve. He's got apparently no qualm about taking this woman who had been fashioned from his own rib, this one whom he was supposed to lead, guide, and protect. He's got no qualms about just throwing her under the bus. And not only that, but he blames God. He says, "The woman whom you gave me," as if this whole thing was God's fault. And the woman who was intended to be Adam's helper in achieving blessing instead became his partner in crime, and she blames the serpent. And the serpent, well, he didn't have a leg to stand on, did he? Literally. But God will have none of it. God isn't going to stand for placing blame. He knows where the blame lies. And he also knows that judgment has to come. And so God pronounces curses. And he begins with the serpent. Look with me in verses 14 and 15. Yahweh God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." Now, the judgment that was placed on the serpent was called a curse. In fact, that's how God begins. "Cursed are you." He was consigned to a life of crawling on his belly and eating dust. And that's not to explain some kind of biological fact about snakes. What it does is indicate the lowly state to which the serpent is now to be associated with. In fact, licking dust or eating dust is sprinkled throughout the Old Testament is as just about a humiliating state as anybody would want to be in. We'll look at one verse. Micah 7 and verse 17 talks of God's enemies and says, "They will lick the dust like a serpent, like reptiles of the earth. They will come trembling out of their fortresses. To Yahweh our God they will come in dread, and they will be afraid before you." So the serpent is consigned to this lowly state. But not only that, his ultimate defeat is foretold. And what we see in verse 15 is what is clearly one of the first, if not the first, messianic prophecies, a foretelling of one who will come and absolutely defeat the works of the serpent, of the devil, of Satan. We see where the seed of woman, one of her descendants, is finally going to deal a crushing blow to the head of the serpent, defeating him forever. Well, of course, who else could that be but Jesus? And what else could it refer to other than Jesus' victory over sin? Notice with me the judgment on the woman in verse 16. To the woman God said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Now remember, she was supposed to be a partner with her husband in order to be fruitful and multiply. But now pain would be multiplied on her. In the multiplication that was supposed to be a blessing to her, to be fruitful and multiply, in that multiplication, pain would come back to her, multiplied. This one flesh relationship that she had with her husband now would be strained by something. It says, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. There's all kinds of questions about what exactly this means. But it seems best to me just to compare it with how this very phrase is used in the very next chapter. Remember in Genesis chapter 4, if you've read through it, you see where Cain is deliberating his resentment over his brother Abel. And he's figuring on doing something. And God comes to warn him. And in Genesis chapter 4, in verse 6, God asks Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? He says, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? In other words, if you just do the right thing, don't you think you're going to feel better about it? Don't you think it's going to be better for you? And then God says in Genesis 4 and in verse 7, the second half of that verse, he says, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you, but you must master it. And I think what God says there helps us understand the curse of the woman in Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 16. Her desire would be apparently to rule over her husband, but God says that's not your role. He will rule over you. And so we're reminded throughout the Bible, and especially in the New Testament, of woman's role to lovingly give her submission to her husband, and the husband's role in being head in the family. Notice also with me, as we go back to Genesis chapter 3, now the curse that's brought on the man in verses 17 through 19. It says, then to Adam he said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Adam's failure brought a curse upon the land, which in turn was a curse on him. Cursed is the ground because of you, God says. And it's going to be this way until you return to the ground. Now remember, originally, the man was given the task to cultivate the garden. But now that task would turn into laborious work. It would turn into toil. That's a specific kind of word that God uses. It's hard effort that now would be Adam's lot. He would have to fight the inedible to get out the edible. Remember, before God had given them every green plant for food. Well, now he's going to have to fight the thistles and the thorns to get those green plants. He was going to have to fight the inedible to get the edible. And worse, he would ultimately die. Remember, that's the promise that God had made. That's the consequence that he said would be coming from disobeying him. In the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Well, although death didn't come physically at that point, it will eventually, but it came spiritually immediately. There was a severance. There was a separation and estrangement in their relationship to God. It had been impaired in a way that they never could have seen. God basically tells Adam what has become a cliche in our day and time. You've heard it said, life is hard and then you die. Well, that's what God is telling Adam. Life will be hard. But he says it's because of you. And then you'll die. You came from dust, and to dust you'll return. And then it gets worse, as if it could. It does. We see where this paradise, this garden, was lost to them. In verse 20, it says, "Now the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all the living." Remember before in Genesis chapter 2, when God had presented the man's wife to him, he said, "She shall be called woman because she was taken from man." Well, now he gives her a name, Eve, the mother of all the living. And verse 21 says that Yahweh God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. I want you to notice something here. Following the pronouncements of the curses, God provides Adam and his wife with proper covering. Now I want you to notice where that proper covering came from. Verse 21 says that God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. That's a very specific phrase, specific enough to let us know that the death of at least one animal had to occur in order to provide them with adequate covering. Now some see in here a shadow of the death of Christ who covers us. We're told to clothe ourselves in Christ in Galatians chapter 3. But I want you to notice also the difference between what they provided for themselves, those loin coverings in chapter 3 verse 7, and the much more substantial coverings that God had provided here in verse 21. The word for garments is a specific kind of word, and it's variously translated as either clothing or tunics or coats, depending on what Bible translation you use. And most often in the Old Testament, it's associated with the priestly garments, the garb that they would wear, without which they couldn't be acceptable to God. And that may see something as well, that it takes the covering that God provides in order to be acceptable to him. There's the implication that the loin coverings that they made were wholly inadequate. After all, they only covered their loins, and we won't go into much detail about what that is. You know what that is. Just their groin area. And God provided something much more substantial, much more sufficient for covering their nakedness. He covered much more than just their loins. And it took that in order for it to be a proper covering. Gone now was the innocence. Present now was shame and regret. And then notice how they were banished from that paradise. In verse 22 it says, "Then Yahweh God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live together." Now stop right there for a moment. Remember before, the only tree that they were restricted from eating from was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The implication is that they could have eaten from this tree of life. And the verse tells us that apparently one of the benefits of eating from that tree of life is that they'd be able to live forever, right? Well, before they could do that, God expels them from the garden. Verse 23 says, "Therefore, Yahweh God sent them out from the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken. So he drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword, which he turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life." Now they were expelled from the garden. They were denied access to the tree of life. And God had placed a heavenly guard to discourage them, apparently from trying to get back into Eden and towards that tree of life. They had forfeited that on their own. Consider for a moment that none of what the serpent promised had come true. Instead, Adam and his wife experienced sorrow, regret, not to mention having to suffer the consequences of their foolish action. And furthermore, their act affects humanity even to this day. In Romans chapter 5 and in verse 12, the Apostle Paul says, "Through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." Now, one thing I want us to see here is that this does not mean that we carry Adam's sin, that it is somehow imputed to us. That's Calvinism. That's the thought of so-called original sin, that we bear the guilt of Adam's sin. No, Paul says in Romans 5 that we sin, that death spread to all men because all men sin. It comes to us when we sin, that spiritual death, that estrangement from God, that spiritual severance, just as it happened with Adam, happens to us because we sin. But, Paul goes on to tell us, the free gift is not like the transgression. For if by the transgression of the one the many died, much more did the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abound to many. Now, when we stop at Genesis chapter 3, we anticipate that God's going to make everything okay, that eventually things are going to get better. And that's what Paul says in Romans chapter 5 in verse 15, that yes, things will get better. Things have gotten better because of Jesus. And so, as we conclude this study in Genesis chapter 3, the book of beginnings began with God's very good creation, with God's crowning creation, man and his wife, and God's provision, marriage, and then man's devastating disobedience. But also beginning is God's plan through the ages to reconcile sinful man to himself. Remember what he told the serpent in verse 15? "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." You'll nip at him, God says, but he'll crush your head. Thanks be to God for his son Jesus, who has delivered the crushing blow to the devil's work. This grand theme, some have called it the scarlet thread of redemption, runs throughout this book, from cover to cover, from Genesis all the way to Revelation. So when we think of the Bible as history, let's think of it more as his story. The story of God and his Son and his relentless pursuit of fellowship with man. Well, thanks for joining us. We're going to look at another great chapter of the Bible in our next lesson. I hope you'll be back for that. God bless you.